At a fundamental basis, the path to sustainability relies on understanding nature and our interactions with it. In order to talk about those interactions with nature, you need to understand a certain basic ecological vocabulary that you can be able to talk about the natural processes that sustain life and sustain us. But out that way, you've got the Helidon Hills, Helidon Sandstones. All this side is all the volcanics, the Mistake Ranges and the Main Range volcanics and the Mount Barney volcanics.
Mapping, because it's visual, allows a universal conversation. Anyone at any age can look at a map, and particularly if it's an interactive map, and have a good conversation about what that's about.
Well, basically with the mapping I'm doing, I'm relying on a lot of government data sets or remote sense data sets. Now, they are inevitably wrong. They don't have the granularity or the fine-scaled information that someone who's lived in the landscape for a long time will have. So it's important when I'm presenting that information to start off on the basis that the information I'm presenting is wrong, and that I'm not wedded to any of the data that I'm presenting. It's just an approximation of the truth, and it relies on the people in the audience to respond to that. So the aim is to start a landscape conversation, not to present a fait accompli. This is the map, this is how it works.
I see people really twigging into a sense of place when you've got a map there, that they go immediately looking for where they are in that landscape, and then they're able to relate stories about that, and the map really generates that, and you can see that they're either proud or suddenly there's some sort of moment that says, all right, there's a value there that I didn't know, and it actually has an influence at a much bigger scale, and there I am as custodian.
The basis behind how I think the company needs to be run and structured is very simple. I have 3 areas I pay attention to. One is our identity, who we are to this region, who we are to ourselves. The second bit is the relationships. Nothing happens without relationships. And in fact, NRM is a game of relationships. But knowing who you are and where you fit doesn't mean a thing without that local knowledge and without the technical knowledge made into something that people on land understand. And that's where a bloke like Mick Petter comes in. He's a very driven guy, has an eclectic knowledge, does fractal mathematics on the weekend for fun. He is easily the brightest person I've met in my career and in my life. But it's because he's got a knowledge that has been learned from Aboriginal folk, from science, from his own insatiable thirst for knowledge. He is able to bring together disparate techniques, tools, processes into developing derived data, which is unique. I've not struck it.
One very well known regional and statutory planner was most bemused by one particular product that Mick and his colleagues had produced, and he just kept muttering all the time, well, you just can't go around making new things up, Mick. And it was like, it sort of became our mantra then that, okay, we're going to make something, I knew it was just, seemed to be that, making things that were just, people hadn't thought of using data in that way.
Maps can be mind-altering. This is a little map I use sometimes to explain to people in North America what the climate of Australia is like. And it's just a way of just how maps can change how you think about things. Like, most people wouldn't normally think that Brisbane is the equivalent of Florida, or that Cape York is the equivalent of Honduras, or that Tasmania is the equivalent of Ohio and Chicago. So it's just a way of just how changing a little bit of information, changing its context, can alter how you think about things. So maps are very powerful at altering how we think about things. And we're a visual creature, so the image is very powerful. Okay, so how do you turn all this sort of things into a regular process to go out, map landscapes, and determine where the best place to go, to do things are? In southeast Queensland, which I know best, we had the Southeast Queensland Natural Resource Management Plan, which a lot of regions have, but ours was underpinned by a Natural Resource Atlas, which was updated, as I said, about 15 times as the basis of round tables. We were then able to produce a South East Queensland Natural Asset Status Report. We were able to go and track how those indicators and benchmarks were travelling over time, to not just give a static picture, but to give that dynamic picture of how things were progressing over time. We had over 80 map layers, such as waterways, coast, biodiversity, more. We had an expert panel of scientists, over 100 scientific experts advising us. It was then vetted by citizen science from wildlife, water quality groups, Reef Check, Seagrass Watch, Mangrove Watch. And then, of course, we went out to regional local land care groups, local communities, and presented that information. So we got the data, we went to the experts, we went to the citizen science, we went to the community, we went back to the government, and around and round and round we went. And eventually we were able to document exactly where our region was trending, where our investments were having an impact on water quality and land management, where they weren't, where community effort was, where all the different projects were, how many of those projects were addressing strategic priorities, how many of them were achieving landscape change. Round and round and round again. But every time getting better and better at targeting exactly what, where and how. So that's the whole point. Know what, know where, know how. This is just some photos of those different workshops that we did. So this one here is an example of a community meeting in Kilcoy, where we would present our mapping and everyone would have a go at our maps and change them. This is us doing a bit of field checking of our mapping, because there's no point doing a map and not going out and ground truthing it. So this was after the 2011 floods, looking at what had happened to road infrastructure. Obviously, you get an idea of the region I work in now, SQ Landscapes. In the past, I've done plenty of field trips, and this is an example of sort of road you spend a lot of time looking at in the region I'm currently working in. This is working with flood mappers and flood planners and architects, working out how to make communities more flood resilient using some of the mapping products that we did. And that overall led to a Water Futures book. And of course, going out with the usual crew of suspects, looking for the overland route to land care, trying to navigate our way through the ever-shifting funding priorities of land care, while going out and looking at the same landscape, working out what we can do, how we can match the latest government priorities, the latest guidelines, the latest checklists we have to use to find our way to achieve that sort of promised land of getting land care all the money it needs to do everything it needs on the ground where it needs to do it. Okay, so now I get into a couple of case studies about this know what, know where. This is a couple of case studies I've worked with here at SQ Landscapes over the last 8 months or so. This is an example of the Brigalow Belt Recovery Program. Basically, the Brigalow Belt was given away free to people on the basis that they cleared it, and now, having cleared it all, everyone's decided at a higher level that, of course, it's now endangered because 98% of it's been removed. So now we're left with this incredibly fragmented landscape of Brigalow remnants, which are these very light blue, thin little bits here. That's what was left. I mean, that was a legal requirement of gaining title to the land. You had to clear it. So people were very efficient at doing that, very thorough and very diligent. That's left us with this incredibly fragmented landscape. So what we were able to do mathematically is identify these yellow areas, which is where the biggest fragments of Brigalow Belt were clustered in proximity to each other. So we had the best bet of being able to join them back together or do a bit of edge sealing or something like that. These purple zones indicate different pathways of connection through the landscape between these tiny little fragments. So we identified these largest clusters of Brigalow Belt fragments and the smaller clusters, and we sort of said that these are our interim action zones, but of course that mapping's wrong or not necessarily useful. So as soon as our staff started to go out to landholders, particular landholder said, well, how can I get involved? Is my property important at all? So if we look at this individual property, we can see by itself it doesn't have a lot of remnants, but it's part of this connection zone. It could potentially form a corridor to link through here to this major blob down here, this major management zone down here. And so on that basis, they may decide to do like a shelter belt or something along the fence line here. So using this map, you can say whether someone's right on the edge, whether it's a a long shot call to join these fragments together, where it's an absolute dead cert to go ahead and connect these remnant brigalow belt things together, or whether it's just a lot of hard yards connecting these linear things together to form a bigger clump. Any one of those could work, it just depends how much money you want to invest in it. Now this map doesn't tell you what to do with these little bits here. Obviously there's lots of things you can do. You can sort of cluster them at where they join and make round bits, but this map won't tell it. This map just starts the conversation about where we should do the work, not what sort of work we should do. Here's another example, recently came in. Again, a property owner who'd previously been involved with land care wanted to know what they could do for the brigalow belt recovery program. In this case, they only had a few little bits of brigalow right on the edge of their property, but as you can see, there's one large brigalow remnant here, cluster. There's another brigalow remnant cluster here. There's a smaller, lower priority cluster, and this property can form the connection between this cluster, and that. So by doing something here with the brigalow remnants at either end of their property and maybe creating a shelter belt up the fence lines, we can connect this cluster of brigalow to that smaller cluster. So once again, you can see how the mathematics has identified the clusters. The staff then go out and find people on the ground, start the conversation about what they can do. They then ask the mapping unit. The mapping unit will come back to them and say, yep, it can form a linkage between two priority action zones through another smaller area. And then they can determine whether or not that's an actual priority for investment. Another project we worked on dealing with highly fragmented remnant landscapes is grasslands. Now, grasslands Australia-wide have been largely removed and replaced with improved pastures. So grassland as a whole has had over 90% of its extent removed on the east coast of Australia. Generally only survives in very small remnants or in high altitude areas. This is a project in the Condamine catchment. Again, we were able to identify clusters of grassland remnants, which are these areas in red, and we were able to identify priority zones for actions. This site came up here with an academic, with a government official saying, we actually identified a rare plant that occurs in this. It wasn't part of our agreed management priorities. It was marked to be investigated because it was a large remnant. We used satellite information, which is these colour codes here, to look at the amount of bare ground in the remnant. So dark green is very high grass cover, purple and browns not so much. So we can see that there's a bit of infrastructure here, a bit of clearing along the paddocks, but overall we've got a large intact remnant. It was outside of the priority zones. It didn't meet the initial criteria, but it was marked to investigate. So we knew the mapping for the priority was wrong. Experts have come along and said there's a rare plant here. We had already marked it to be investigated. Now they've investigated it and it will now become a priority for grassland rehabilitation. So using a combination of mathematics, satellite imagery, on-ground work and expert knowledge, we've been able to drag that particular remnant up into a higher priority. The last example I want to look at before we wind up is one, again, going back to LiDAR. This is what you can do with LiDAR if you compare two time periods. In this map, red is loss, blue is gain. So in the 5 years between the two LiDAR images, this was dug out, piled up here. The creek was lowered by approximately 1 metre. You can see where deposition came from these broken erosion control banks here and deposited on the floodplain and deposited here. But the creek was eroding all the way along. We can see where little bits of hill slope erosion are happening. We can see where engineering works have been done on the highway to dig areas out and to pile them up. So you can actually turn the static map into precise information about exactly where you're losing landscape, where it's being deposited, and where you should take action. So that's down to the square metre.
staff here and the Southern Queensland landscapes can point to an area where those outcomes can be achieved or worked on. And it's going to be really exciting to see how that's done over such a large area. Shows you that you can do, you can invent, make new things, and have them and apply them in a context which is so diverse and so huge as Southern Queensland.
The opportunities are great, the needs are great, and the threats are great and going to get greater. There's nothing we can do about the level of threats we're going to have now. They're just going to be the same or better for the next 500 years or more. We can choose how worse we make it, but the level of threat's going to be there, and the ecological transition we have to go through is absolutely fundamental. Regional groups and regional NRM groups are going to be absolutely vital in that ecological transition, and data to support that and mapping to support that, to know what, where, when and how to do things is going to be absolutely vital.
Apart from psychopaths, people are wired to do good, and the job of a company like ours, particularly in the knowledge space, is to offer knowledge, not in a way that's accusing or condemning or any more important than any other knowledge someone has. But in offering that knowledge, I'm absolutely convinced that people will choose to do good things. Our challenge is how we package that and reach people in a way which haven't been done before.